Under the leadership of the President and First Secretary of ZANU-PF, His Excellency Comrade Dr. E.D. Mnangagwa, it is resolved that his term of office as President of the Republic of Zimbabwe be extended beyond 2028 to 2030.
What if the real fight in Zimbabwe isn't about a president, but about a calendar? Why does the number 2030 suddenly feel political? Why would a country that voted for term limits barely a decade ago reopen that conversation now? There's a tension here that goes beyond one leader, one bill, or one election cycle. It touches memory, generational frustration, and the unfinished promises of independence. Zimbabwe stands at a crossroads where continuity collides with renewal. The question isn't just who leads, it's what kind of system the next decade will inherit. Let's find out. Before we even debate personalities, we need to understand timing. Systems do not suddenly ask for more time unless they feel something pressing against them. Zimbabwe's cabinet has approved draft legislation that could extend presidential terms from 5 years to 7 and shift presidential selection from a direct national vote to a parliamentary process. That is not a minor adjustment. That is structural recalibration. Officially, the justification circles around stability. 5-year cycles, the argument goes. Keep the country in permanent campaign mode. Elections are expensive. They polarize society. They freeze long-term planning because governments hesitate to push difficult reforms when the next vote is always around the corner. Extend the cycle, and you reduce the political noise. Shift selection to parliament, and you avoid nationwide mobilization battles that often leave institutions strained. That is the administrative logic. But administrative logic never exists alone. Behind it sits political arithmetic. Zimbabwe's ruling party, ZANU-PF, holds dominant influence in parliament. Under a parliamentary selection system, leadership would emerge from internal party consensus rather than national campaigning. That changes the center of gravity. Power consolidates inward. Negotiation shifts from public rallies to internal caucus rooms. Loyalty networks matter more than mass enthusiasm. For supporters of the reform, this is maturity, moving away from emotional election cycles toward disciplined governance. For critics, it is insulation, a way of narrowing the pathway to leadership and reducing direct public leverage. But the deeper tension lies elsewhere. Zimbabwe's modern political identity was reshaped in 2013 when citizens voted overwhelmingly for a new constitution that introduced presidential term limits. That referendum was not accidental. It emerged from a long era under Robert Mugabe, whose decades-long tenure left scars on institutions and public trust. Term limits were meant to signal renewal, a commitment that no individual would outlast the system again. Now the system itself is being revisited. This is where the youth lens becomes critical. African Gen Z is not emotionally attached to liberation-era narratives. They are attached to results. If extending terms produces measurable economic momentum, visible reforms, and institutional strength, they may interpret it as strategic patience. But if the extension appears disconnected from the transformation, it will feel like repetition dressed as reform. And repetition is exactly what this generation distrusts. Because here is the reality. Zimbabwe's economy has struggled with volatility for years. Currency shifts, investor caution, and contested elections. From a technocratic standpoint, longer terms could create policy continuity. Major infrastructure projects, fiscal reforms, and currency stabilization programs often require sustained leadership. Yet stability is not just about duration, it is about legitimacy. When you extend time, you must expand trust. So the real issue is not whether 7 years is better than 5. It is whether citizens believe the additional time will be used differently from the previous cycles. If governance structures are redesigned, but governance culture remains unchanged, nothing fundamentally shifts. Which brings us to the next question. If this reform is framed as strengthening governance, who ultimately becomes stronger under it?
Typically, the typical African politician, perhaps not in Tanzania today, if they were sick, they had a cold, they would not go to Muhimbili, they would go to London. If they were Kenyan, they would not go to Kenyatta Hospital, they would run to the United Kingdom. Tragedy, no hygiene in our politics because Africans had started engaging in theft. In fact, I used to say that African politicians were thieves. Then I went to Uganda and I was told that they are not thieves, they are looters. And when I went to Liberia last week, I was told they are not looters. I was told they are looters on an industrial scale.
Power never disappears, it relocates. When a country shifts from direct national elections to parliamentary selection, the public spotlight dims and the internal corridors brighten. Under the proposed reform, members of parliament would choose the president. That means party structures, caucus alliances, and internal hierarchies become decisive arenas. In Zimbabwe, that arena is largely shaped by ZANU-PF. The party dominates parliament. It controls candidate selection in most constituencies. It manages internal discipline. So under a parliamentary model, leadership would likely emerge from within the party's internal ecosystem rather than from a national campaign trail. Supporters say this reduces chaos. No massive rallies, no countrywide tensions, no contested vote tallies dominating headlines. Parliamentary systems across the world function this way. They argue Zimbabwe would simply be aligning governance with institutional representation. But alignment depends on context. In societies where internal party democracy is robust, parliamentary selection can feel legitimate. In societies where party hierarchies are tightly controlled, it can feel predetermined. So the real question becomes, how competitive is internal competition? Under direct elections, opposition movements can mobilize citizens beyond parliamentary arithmetic. They can build momentum from below. Under parliamentary selection, opposition strength depends almost entirely on legislative seats. That narrows the battlefield. And this is where generational politics enters. Young Zimbabweans are not just frustrated with economic stagnation. They are frustrated with predictability. Predictability in leadership pipelines. Predictability in patronage networks. Predictability in political outcomes. If this reform strengthens institutional governance while also widening opportunity within party structures, it could signal evolution. But if it merely locks leadership succession inside familiar circles, it reinforces the idea that politics is a closed room with limited chairs. The debate intensifies further when you consider the sitting president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. He came to power after a military-assisted transition ended the era of Robert Mugabe. His leadership has been defined by survival, navigating internal factions, economic turbulence, and international scrutiny. Extending terms under his watch inevitably raises suspicion. Even if the reform applies broadly, timing shapes perception. Citizens ask, is this system being redesigned for the future or tailored to the present? And perception in politics is rarely neutral. Because here's the tension youth across Africa feel. They do not automatically reject strong leadership. In fact, many admire decisive figures who promise sovereignty and economic momentum, but they resist leadership that appears immune to renewal. So if the parliamentary shift strengthens institutions beyond personalities, it might be seen as structural maturation. But if it strengthens personalities more than institutions, the generational reaction will harden, which leads to the next layer of this story. Is the push for more time driven by unfinished national reforms or by unfinished internal power battles? Every political reform has two faces, the public explanation and the private calculation. On the surface, extending terms and shifting selection methods can be framed as governance upgrades. Beneath the surface, they often intersect with succession politics. Zimbabwe's ruling landscape has never been free of internal contests. After the removal of Robert Mugabe in 2017, the transition that elevated Emmerson Mnangagwa was not merely a change of leadership, it was the outcome of factional realignment within ZANU-PF. Power blocks shifted, alliances reassembled. Old rivalries did not disappear, they recalibrated. Succession in liberation-era parties is rarely straightforward. These movements were built through struggle, loyalty, and hierarchy forged in war. That culture does not evaporate when constitutions are amended. It shapes how transitions unfold, It shapes who is considered ready. It shapes who is considered a threat. So when constitutional reform appears in such an environment, observers naturally ask whether it is shielding broader policy continuity or managing internal succession anxiety. Because succession is destabilizing. Even the anticipation of a leadership change can fracture party unity. Ambition surfaces. Camps form. Investors hesitate. Civil servants wait to see which direction the winds will blow. In that context, extending time can function as a pressure valve, postponing internal battles while maintaining outward coherence. But postponement is not a resolution. If the reform is truly about finishing economic restructuring, stabilizing currency systems, reinforcing agricultural production, and strengthening mining policy frameworks, then time becomes a strategic asset. Long-term programs cannot be executed through constant political uncertainty. Yet if reform becomes a mechanism to delay inevitable generational transition inside party ranks, it risks deepening the very instability it seeks to avoid. African youth have grown observant of this pattern across the continent. They have watched leaders argue that continuity is necessary for development, only to see internal rivalries paralyze momentum. They are skeptical of narratives that equate longevity with progress. At the same time, they are wary of abrupt transitions that collapse institutional memory. This creates a dilemma unique to post-liberation states: how to transition authority without destabilizing the structure that liberation movement built. Mnangagwa's political identity is rooted in survival. His nickname, the Crocodile, reflects patience and calculation. That reputation cuts both ways. To supporters, it signals strategic endurance. To critics, it signals political maneuvering. So the reform debate cannot be isolated from party dynamics. Extending terms affects not just the presidency, but the timeline of every aspiring successor within the ruling establishment. And that leads us to the heart of the matter. If this reform reduces immediate factional tension, does it strengthen the state or simply delay the next confrontation? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Now we arrive at the most sensitive layer of this debate: legitimacy. It is one thing to argue that longer terms reduce political turbulence. It is another to ask whether reducing public participation in presidential selection strengthens or weakens the social contract. Under the proposed reform, the president would no longer be chosen directly by citizens through a national ballot. Instead, members of parliament would determine leadership. Technically, those MPs are elected representatives. In theory, that preserves democratic structure. But democracy is not only procedural, but it is psychological. Citizens must feel that leadership flows from their will, not merely from institutional mechanics. Zimbabwe's political memory carries weight here. The 2013 Constitution, approved through referendum, introduced term limits precisely to prevent the concentration of authority. It was a symbolic reset after decades under Robert Mugabe. It represented a collective agreement that leadership must circulate. When that agreement is revisited, even if technically lawful, it triggers emotional recall. Legitimacy is fragile in societies where trust has been tested. Currency instability, disputed election outcomes, and economic hardship all compound skepticism. So when reform is framed as enhancing stability, the public measures it against lived experience. If stability previously coincided with exclusion, then structural adjustments feel suspect. At the same time, direct elections are not inherently pure. They can deepen polarization. They can create flashpoints. They can strain already divided societies. In fragile economies, national electoral seasons often freeze investment and escalate rhetoric beyond reconciliation. That is the paradox. Direct mandate strengthens legitimacy but may intensify volatility. Parliamentary mandate reduces volatility but may weaken direct ownership. The success of such a shift depends entirely on institutional credibility. If parliament is viewed as reflective of genuine public representation, parliamentary selection may feel rational. If parliament is perceived as insulated from grassroots accountability, it may feel like a distance. African Gen Z does not measure democracy by theory. They measure it by visibility. Are decisions transparent? Are leaders accessible? Are institutions responsive? Or do reforms appear designed behind closed doors? Legitimacy in the digital age is amplified by perception. Young citizens document, analyze, debate, and critique in real time. Political architecture that once relied on controlled narratives now operates under constant scrutiny. So the question is not simply whether Zimbabwe can legally implement this reform, it is whether citizens will emotionally accept it. Because legitimacy cannot be legislated. It must be earned. And that brings us to the most unpredictable variable in this entire equation. If public trust does not expand alongside structural reform, what happens next? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If legitimacy is not felt, it does not matter how technically sound a reform may be. Trust becomes the arena where the real contest unfolds. And in Zimbabwe, trust has layers. It is economic, built or broken by currency stability, job creation, and price consistency. It is politically shaped by whether citizens believe institutions serve the public rather than personalities. It is generational, determined by whether young people see a pathway into influence or only observe closed circles rotating internally. When trust is thin, every reform is interpreted through suspicion. Consider the symbolic weight of dissent within the ruling movement itself. Blessed Geza, known as Bombshell, openly criticized the direction of leadership and questioned the ambition to remain beyond 2028. His opposition did not come from an external rival party. It came from someone rooted in the liberation struggle. That matters. Internal dissent reveals fractures that cannot be dismissed as opposition politics. It signals unease within the architecture of power. For youth observers, this becomes instructive. If even war veterans question direction, what does that imply about generational transition inside liberation movements? Does reform address that transition or postpone it? Trust erodes not only when leaders extend tenure. It erodes when citizens feel unheard. In an era where young Africans are hyper-connected, debating continental sovereignty, watching resource nationalism unfold in places like the Sahel, questioning economic dependency models, they expect participation in shaping systems. They do not want abrupt instability, but they also do not want structures that feel static. This is where the broader African context becomes relevant. Across the continent, governments are experimenting with economic independence strategies, local refining of natural resources, renegotiation of foreign partnerships, and recalibration of external military presence. These shifts signal a desire for autonomy. Zimbabwe's constitutional debate exists within that atmosphere of recalibration. But autonomy without accountability risks becoming insular. If reform is paired with visible inclusion, open consultations, transparent legal review, and clear economic benchmarks, trust can be strengthened. If reform appears rushed, defensive, or opaque, skepticism multiplies. The most dangerous outcome is not protesting. It is apathy. When young citizens disengage because they believe outcomes are predetermined, political systems hollow from within. So the real battleground is not parliament, it is perception. Will Zimbabwe's youth interpret this reform as structural evolution aligned with national strategy, or as insulation from generational pressure? And if perception tips toward insulation, how long can stability truly last without emotional investment from the next generation? Strip away the personalities, remove the slogans, silence the noise. What remains is a blueprint question. Zimbabwe is not merely debating whether one president stays longer. It is deciding what kind of political architecture will define the next decade. That is bigger than any individual, because every constitutional shift creates precedent. If the country moves from direct national selection to parliamentary choice, it reshapes the relationship between citizen and executive. If presidential terms extend from 5 to 7 years, it alters the rhythm of accountability. And once rhythms change, expectations change with them. History teaches something uncomfortable. Systems rarely revert to their original form once restructured. The trajectory bends, and future leaders inherit the new design, whether they agree with it or not. So the deeper issue becomes generational inheritance. African youth are not rejecting authority itself. They are rejecting stagnation disguised as continuity. Across the continent, there is an appetite for leadership that feels decisive yet transitional. Leaders who build structures stronger than themselves. If Zimbabwe's reform becomes a platform for institutional strengthening, clearer economic planning cycles, improved parliamentary transparency, and strengthened judiciary independence, it could evolve into a model of structured governance rather than personality-driven politics. But if it centers primarily around tenure rather than transformation, history will not be generous. There is also the continental dimension. Africa is in a period of experimentation. Countries are reassessing monetary policy, resource sovereignty, regional blocs, and geopolitical alignment. In that context, Zimbabwe's constitutional recalibration may be interpreted as part of a broader pattern, states attempting to stabilize internally while navigating global economic pressures. Yet sovereignty is not the absence of limits. True sovereignty means the power to redesign your system and the discipline to protect its credibility. If Zimbabwe extends time but strengthens oversight, expands youth inclusion in economic policy, and demonstrates measurable progress in development indicators, then 2030 could symbolize strategic endurance. If it extends time without visible structural renewal, then 2030 risks symbolizing deferred transition. And that distinction will define how this moment is remembered. Political systems are not judged in the year they change. They are judged in the years that follow. When the next generation looks back, they will not ask whether a bill passed. They will ask whether their opportunities expanded. They will ask whether stability created momentum. They will ask whether leadership redesigned itself or merely prolonged itself. So here is the final question, the one that sits beyond constitutional language and parliamentary votes. When Zimbabwe arrives at the next decade, will its youth feel that the system evolved with them, or that it moved ahead without them? Let us know in the comment section. What do you think about it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.